My dear students, in the second online lecture series, today we will discuss sources of law from Unit 2, Part D, Semester 4, Paper Code 401. First of all, we need to understand what is law. According to Holland, law is a general rule of external human action enforced by a political sovereign. And as per Salmond, law is the body of principles recognized and applied by the state in the administration of justice. First of all, we need to understand what is the difference between the law and a law. The term law is used in two ways. In abstract sense, it means a system of law like the law of India, and in concrete sense, it means a particular statute or enactment like the Indian Penal Code. Now we need to understand what are the sources of law. Every country's legal system has its own distinctive sources of law. In the modern jurisprudence, the term source of law is used in two contexts. Firstly, in the sense of state or the sovereign from which the law derives its force and validity. Secondly, to denote the cause of law or the contents or matter of which law is composed. According to Dr. C.K. Allen, the true sources of law are agencies through which the rules of conduct acquires the character of law because of its certainty, uniformity, and binding force. According to HPUILS, the sources of law includes the material from which the judge obtains rules for deciding the cases. Tracing the historical background, we need to understand few more points. Our Dharam Shastras authenticates that ancient India evolved and observed the doctrine of rule of law, that is the dharma, both in letter and spirit. The king, the state, the government and the praja, the people, were all subordinate to dharma. The king was never above the law and dharma alone ruled the king. Therefore, ancient Hindus were also governed by law. As the Vedas have propounded, law is the king of kings, far more powerful and rigid than they. Nothing can be mightier than law, by whose aid, as by that of the highest monarch, even the weak may prevail over the strong. Now let us have a look at the flowchart to understand the division of sources of law. Sources of law can be divided or understood as material sources or formal sources. Under material sources, historical sources and legal sources are of great importance. The legal sources are further divided into legislation, precedents, customary laws, and conventional laws. Classification of sources of law. Salmond's classification is important, where Salmond has divided the sources of law into two classes, formal sources and material sources. Formal sources are those sources from which the law derives its force and validity. Example, law enacted by the state or sovereign. The material sources of law. Material source of law is that source from which law derives the matter of which it is composed. As for an example, custom. Material sources are further divided into legal and historical. Legal sources of law are those sources which are authoritative and they are recognized as such by the law itself, and they are the immediate source of law. Legal sources of law. Legal sources of law may be divided into following classes. Firstly, enacted laws having its source in legislation, case laws having its source in the precedent, customary laws having its source in customs, and conventional laws having its source in agreement. The historical sources. The historical sources are unauthoritative. They are sources in fact, but they have no legal recognition. They operate indirectly and mediately. Under this class comes the juristic writings, foreign decisions, and numerous other things from which a judge derives help in shaping his judgment. Historical sources may become legal if they are recognized by law as such or when they are incorporated in law. Legislation is one of the most important sources of law. The word legislation is a combination of two words, legis, which means law, and latum, which means to make or set. The common meaning of legislation is the making of law. It may be defined as the promulgation of legal rules by an authority which has the power to do so. Legislation remains one of the most important sources of law. It involves laying down of legal rules by the legislation which the state recognizes as law. Secondly, it also has the force and authority of the state. Law and morals. Morals as the basis of law. Earlier, there was no difference between law and morals. When state came into being, it picked up those rules which were better for the society. Most of the rules are same. Example, to kill a man or to steal are considered as immoral acts everywhere. It is on this ground that law is said to be minimum ethics. An important case to understand the relationship between law and morals is Queen versus Dudley and Stephens, which states that acts could not be immoral and not necessarily illegal, and it is not possible to isolate one. The principles laid down in Queen versus Dudley case are worth mentioning. The crew of an English yacht, in which 3 seamen were travelling and a boy, were cast away in a storm, who were compelled to put into an open boat belonging to the same yacht. As they were not having food or water to survive, they killed the boy in order to save themselves. The principle driven home is that no man has a right to take another's life to save his own. Let us have a look at the differences between law and morals. Law is related to the time and place, therefore, it varies from society to society. On the other hand, morals are considered to be of universal value. The application of law is uniform. On the other hand, morals are applied taking into consideration the individual cases. Let us have a look at the differences between legislation and precedent. Legislation has source in lawmaking. On the other hand, the precedent has source in judicial decisions. Legislation is imposed on courts by the legislature. On the other hand, precedents are created by the courts themselves. The legislation has formal declaration, and on the other hand, the precedents have application of new principles of law by the courts. The legislation is prospective and the precedents are retrospective. The legislation uses deductive methods. On the other hand, the precedents use inductive methods. Precedent. A precedent is a previous instance or case which is or may be taken as an example of rule for subsequent cases, or by which some similar act or circumstances may be supported, and it always remains an important source of law. Some views by jurists on legislation. Analytical jurists like Austin and Bentham believe that legislation is always superior to precedent. A statute is made after due deliberation and not in a haste in which a judge disposes of his case. Statutes are therefore certain, clear, comprehensive, easily accessible, whereas precedent is the result of the whim of certain individuals, that is obiter dicta. Customs as source of law. Custom is to society what law is to the state. Customs consist of rules of conduct. According to Salmon, custom is the embodiment of those principles which have commended themselves to natural concise and as principles of truth, justice and public utility. Customs are of two types, legal and conventional. A legal custom has the force of law. It can be general or local custom. If observed by all the members of a society, it is a general custom, and if observed by the residents of a locality, only then it is called a local custom. Conventional customs, on the other hand, are the ones whose authority depends on its acceptance. A custom becomes a law only when the sovereign sanctions it, and the customs not sanctioned or declared remain positive morality. According to Gray, customs are not law until approved by a judge. Gray says the true view is that the law is what the judges declare, that statutes, precedents, the opinions of the learned experts, customs, and morality are the sources of law. Dear students, take care, stay healthy, and all the best for your upcoming exams.